China just proved America's most powerful weapon is useless. For decades, the United States controlled countries like Iran through economic strangulation, block their oil sales, freeze their bank accounts, cut them off from global markets. The strategy works because America controls the ocean, and if you need to move something in large quantities, you almost always have to use those waters. China built a railway that bypasses the ocean entirely. 10,400 kilometers of track running through 4 countries, crossing deserts and mountains, delivering cargo to Iran in 15 days while the sea route takes 40. No Western Navy can patrol it. No sanctions can touch it. No blockade can close it. The economic fence that took decades to build just had a hole punched through it, and that hole is getting bigger. How did China build this without America stopping it? There's a passage of water between Malaysia and Indonesia that most people have never heard of, but China's entire economy depends on it staying open. The Strait of Malacca. Over 94,000 ships pass through it every single year, and about 80% of China's oil imports flow through this single passage. If it were closed for just 1 week, China could lose up to $64 million, and a closure lasting longer would shut down factories and cut fuel supplies to over 1 billion people. The world's second largest economy running on a single thread. The part that kept Chinese planners awake is that since 2019, the United States has had the right to dock warships at Singapore's naval bases, and Singapore sits right at the entrance to the Strait of Malacca. In a serious conflict, the US could close that passage within 24 hours, and China's energy supply would switch off like a light. Factories would go dark. Transportation networks would grind down. The leverage would be absolute. There's no easy maritime alternative. The Lombok Strait and Sunda Strait add thousands of kilometers and aren't equipped to handle the traffic volume, which means rerouting would take years of investment. China doesn't have time to complete. China needed a route that no navy could threaten, and no sanctions could reach, and no blockade could close, and the answer was to leave the ocean behind entirely. And the only country whose geography made that possible was Iran. Building a railway from China to Iran means crossing some of the most punishing terrain on Earth, where massive deserts shift sand beneath the surface, and mountain ranges sit in earthquake zones, and temperatures crack concrete and warp metal. Summer heat reaches 50 degrees Celsius in some sections. Winter cold drops below -40 in others. The engineering tolerances had to account for temperature swings of 90 degrees. The route passes through 4 countries with their own borders and customs and railway gauges that were never designed to connect. And the railway begins in western China and heads westward across Kazakhstan, then through Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, before finally crossing into Iran. That's 10,400 kilometers of connected track, roughly the same as flying from London to Los Angeles, with hundreds of kilometers still remaining. The project cost upward of $2 billion from Chinese policy banks and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, keeping Western financial institutions completely out. Solving the gauge mismatch was itself a major undertaking, because Russia and Central Asia use a broader gauge than China, which means specialized bogie exchange systems had to be installed so containers can roll across different track widths. Automated stations at border crossings cut transition time from hours down to under 30 minutes. Key stretches in Iran were built underground, not just for extreme weather, but to protect the line from potential airstrikes. Concrete and steel buried beneath meters of earth and rock. That single decision shows how seriously both countries approach this project, because this wasn't built for convenience, but to survive a crisis. The first freight train completed the journey in 15 days. Before this railway existed, the same cargo traveled by ship through the Strait of Malacca and across the Indian Ocean, and through the Arabian Sea and around the Persian Gulf, taking between 30 and 40 days. The railway cut the time in half with no oceans and no naval patrols, and no Western-controlled ports, and no enforceable sanctions in between. China's state media called this route the oil lifeline between the two nations. But what this railway means for Iran runs much deeper than just a faster delivery schedule. Western sanctions have been grinding down Iran's economy for years. Banks were cut off from global networks, companies faced penalties from Washington, and oil buyers were warned away with threats of losing access to US markets. The message was simple: trade with Iran and pay the price. And for years that worked, because most countries couldn't afford to lose access to Western financial systems. China decided the price was worth it. In 2021, China and Iran signed a 25-year economic cooperation agreement worth $400 billion, covering energy and infrastructure and manufacturing and technology. In 2024, China bought 77% of Iran's crude oil exports, worth roughly $29 billion, and Iran's total oil revenues reached $67 billion, which was a level the country hadn't seen in over 10 years. The sanctions were still officially in place, but their real-world impact was shrinking fast. With the railway now running, those oil shipments don't pass through any route the West can monitor, because Iran loads oil onto trains and they roll east through Central Asia and arrive in China without a single Western bank involved. That's not just trade, but a completely parallel economic system operating outside the rules Washington built. A significant part of how that system functions is currency. China has been paying for Iranian oil in yuan since 2012, deliberately bypassing the US dollar. That might sound technical, but the long-term weight is enormous because the dollar's position as the world's default currency for energy trade represents one of the most important pillars of American global influence. Every time a major oil deal settles in yuan instead of dollars, that pillar takes another quiet hit that weakens the entire structure. Russia has pursued a similar strategy by settling a growing share of its energy exports in yuan and rubles rather than dollars, and the combined trade volume flowing outside dollar systems has grown sharply since 2022. The railway makes this shift physical, turning financial strategy into steel rails and freight containers moving without American oversight. And that makes dollar-free trade even easier to execute. Iran's geography makes it even more valuable than just an oil source for China's long-term strategy. The country sits directly beside the Strait of Hormuz, which is a narrow passage connecting the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea, and about 20% of all the world's oil passes through that strait every single day. That location turns Iran into a natural gateway for the entire region, and countries like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and Afghanistan are completely landlocked with no direct access to global shipping routes. Through Iran's ports and China's growing rail network, those countries gain real economic connections for the first time in their modern history, and China gains deeper political and economic influence across a region that has traditionally operated within Western spheres of power. The railway to Iran is just the opening move in a larger plan already in motion. The Five Nations Railway Corridor connects China and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and Afghanistan and Iran in one continuous network stretching 1,300 kilometers with half running through northern Afghanistan. The preliminary agreement was signed in 2014, and in 2023, the first test cargo ran from Iran into Afghanistan, carrying 655 tons of railway equipment, the very tools needed to build more of the network. Senior officials from Iran and China and Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and Turkey met in Tehran in 2025 to expand this network further, and the momentum is real and accelerating. For landlocked nations, this solves a problem they've carried since independence. A rail link through Iran to Persian Gulf ports changes their economic reality completely. Raw materials can flow out, manufactured goods can flow in, trade becomes possible on their own terms, and China deepens its influence across the region by becoming the essential partner that made it possible. The financial architecture matters because China's Belt and Road Initiative has committed over $1 trillion globally since 2013, with Central Asia as one of its most concentrated zones. The loans come with long repayment windows and infrastructure for resources agreements that give China a durable foothold in countries that had few other partners willing to invest. At the same time, China is developing this southern corridor through Central Asia. It's also building a route going in a completely opposite direction through the frozen Arctic. The Northern Sea route runs along the northern coast of Russia through the Arctic Ocean and represents the most direct shipping path between Asia and Europe, cutting the journey from around 45 days via the Suez Canal down to roughly 30 days when the ice allows passage. The obstacle has always been the ice itself, and until recently the Arctic route was only usable for around 88 days per year during summer months. That window is growing longer as global temperatures rise, and Arctic ice retreats earlier each spring and returns later each fall, and the usable window has now stretched to between 90 and 100 days annually, with scientists projecting continued expansion. Russia and China signed a formal agreement in 2024 to build a year-round container shipping line through the Arctic, and they're moving forward with this plan, even as scientists project that by the end of this century, the route could stay open all year long without requiring icebreaker assistance. To navigate the ice that remains during colder months, Russia has built the most powerful icebreakers ever made. The Arctica weighs 33,000 tons, while running on 2 nuclear reactors, and can crush through ice up to 3 meters thick at a steady, continuous speed. It can run for 7 full years without refueling. Russia keeps releasing newer and more capable versions, each one pushing further into territory that was previously unreachable, and China is funding construction of its own icebreaker fleet to operate alongside Russian ships. What's particularly significant about the Arctic route is who it cuts out of the shipping process entirely. The Suez Canal operates under Egyptian authority, but sits within a zone of deep Western diplomatic and financial influence, and insurance and financing and logistics for ships using Suez run overwhelmingly through European and American institutions that charge fees and enforce compliance with Western sanctions. A viable Arctic route bypasses all of that institutional control, and together these two routes create a pattern where one cuts through the heart of Central Asia, while the other pushes through the frozen north, and both lead away from the oceans and financial systems the West has shaped for generations. This railway cannot replace ocean shipping on its own. A single supertanker carries 2 million barrels of oil, the equivalent of hundreds of freight trains running continuously, and scaling rail to fully match maritime trade capacity isn't possible in the near term. Multiple border crossings still mean customs checks and coordination delays that slow the process, and desert heat and sandstorms wear down tracks quickly, which requires constant maintenance, and fixed rail lines are inherently easier to target than ships moving across open water, which creates vulnerability that maritime shipping doesn't face. The early results showed exactly those vulnerabilities. Just 19 days after the railway launched its first freight service, Israel conducted a large-scale attack targeting Iranian oil and gas infrastructure. No further public freight services on the corridor were reported after those strikes, and the railway stalled almost as quickly as it started. The railway doesn't need to replace sea routes to matter. It just needs to exist and work well enough to give both sides options they never had before. And the existence of those options changes the strategic calculation even when they're not being used at full capacity. When China has a functioning land route for its energy supply, the threat of a naval blockade at Malacca carries less weight in any negotiation or conflict scenario. When Iran has a committed buyer operating outside Western financial systems, sanctions lose their grip on the country's economic survival because there's always an alternative market available. When landlocked Central Asian nations gain rail connections to global markets, they gain the ability to choose their own partners on their own terms, rather than accepting whatever deal the nearest major power offers. None of these shifts happen in a single dramatic moment, but they happen steadily and quietly, with one freight train at a time. The change accumulates. The alternatives multiply. The old choke points lose their power. Every kilometer of track laid by China in Central Asia sends a message to smaller countries watching from the sidelines. There's another option available beyond the traditional Western-led system, and you don't have to structure your trade or your debt or your infrastructure or your foreign policy around the preferences of Washington or Brussels if you're willing to work with Beijing instead. And that represents one of the most consequential things this railway communicates to the rest of the developing world. What America is watching is not simply a railway connecting two countries, but the slow construction of an alternative to a system the West spent generations building through military power and financial dominance and control over global trade choke points. What China and Iran and Russia and Central Asian nations are building is a parallel answer to that system, and it's incomplete and it faces real obstacles that could derail the entire project. But it's growing, and it's operating in places where the old rules don't reach. Every tunnel dug and every kilometer of track laid and every nuclear-powered icebreaker launched carries a message that says the world doesn't have to work the way it always has. and the countries watching from Washington understand exactly what that means for American influence. And so do the countries building the alternative. What do you think? Can a land route across Central Asia and a frozen Arctic highway ever seriously challenge the dominance of the world's oceans? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this, hit the like button and subscribe. Thanks for watching.